Hello, everyone. This is Nalia Weber, the Executive Director of the Orleans Public Education Network, and I'm glad to welcome you to our next installment of a Public Education Week webinar. Public Education Week is a week-long event series that we do that engages all of the community in conversations around equitable and just education policy and practice, how to support families, educators, and how to build a better system that works for all of our children. And so we're happy to have here with us Crystal Allen, who will be talking with us about what equity looks like in board governance. In this all charter system, majority of our public schools have boards that are running them. And so it's an additional or new layer of governance that is multiple in the city of New Orleans. So it's really important for education stakeholders to understand what equitable leadership looks like so that we can get to equitable practices in our schools and equitable outcomes for our students. So thank you, Crystal, for joining us. Please share with us who you are, your work, and of course, Ms. Castillo.
Well, thank you so much, Nalia, for giving myself and also Lucy the opportunity to partake in this conversation. We are both two proud women of color who are educators and advocates for the things that are right for our children, but also families and our communities as a whole. I am a lifelong educator. I am proud to be an educator and have an experience of being a teacher, a school leader, and now an educational consultant here in the city of New Orleans, but also across the U.S. And abroad in South Africa and Nigeria. I was born and raised in Selma, Alabama, with all of its history rooted in the civil rights movement. And that's a salient part of who I am and how I show up in spaces, and believing that Black and Brown communities especially have within them the tools and assets and the riches that we need to thrive and really change the narrative of what our children are capable of manifesting. I am also an advocate and lots of other domains that are nonprofit and also small businesses for matters of racial equity. And so that's why this conversation is very critical in thinking about, entities and groups and spaces in which racial equity should be centered in education, because often the conversation has really delved into what's happening in the classroom from the vantage point of teachers. And we both believe and know that what our teachers do every day is critical, but we also know that there are lots of entities, policymakers, decision makers, and influencers that also should be promoting and actively championing and advancing racial equity outside of what our teachers do every day. Okay. And so join with me is Lucy Castillo, who is an incredible educational leader, and she's also a mother. And so I'll have her talk a bit about her context and background and what uniquely positions her for this conversation as well.
Thank you. Welcome.
Hello, glad to be here. As Crystal said, I enter this work and it became way more urgent for me when I became a parent. But my own growing up years, I think, had lots of influence and impact. So I'm first generation American. My parents came from Central America. And I would say the central tenet in my development was community. I lived on a street where all the adults took care of all the children. And I assumed that that was just the way all spaces were. So I would say that was impactful. The other was my sort of entree into this work was as a teacher in New York City. And I taught in a fairly diverse community, but I also saw firsthand as a first-year teacher, the resources that I did and didn't have. I was in a tract school, but what I really noticed was the difference at which when students would enter from other parts of the world, my Dominican students were placed in different classes and treated differently than, say, my students from Ukraine or from China. But I think that was my sort of frontline experience of inequity in education and how it played out. And so I have been in the work since then doing lots of different things. And I would say another formative piece was I worked in Newark, New Jersey, and as a leader, as an executive director, and there was a strong level of collegiality, but I also saw the role of certain leaders, primarily leaders of color, leaders from low-income backgrounds, and how they engaged community and families very, very differently than some other organizations. And that was super instructive as well. And so currently I'm the Chief Equity Officer at Education Board Partners, and we work exclusively with boards to focus on equity and to improve their practices by having clarity of role and responsibility, and always through a lens of equity and engagement. And so I'm thrilled to have this conversation with y'all today.
Great. Thank you very much to the both of you for providing this context, how you got into this work, and the values, I guess, and the principles that are grounding you in this work, which will kick off our discussion. So before we even get into, boards and compositions and things like that, we need to kind of get into the values that are driving this system and the language that we're using to talk about all of these things. So when we talk about equity, it's a word that, for a lot of people, they're still like, I don't really understand what equity is or what it means in this context, or if it's even really a thing that can be achieved. And some people would just refer to it as another buzzword, right? But it is indeed a real word that has real implications. But that's not the only word that we concern ourselves with. We also hear diversity, right? When we're talking about shifts that need to be made, we talk about inclusion, adding, including more at the table, as it were. And so let's get into some of that language before we have a conversation about what it means for board, composition and governance and all that. What are we talking about when we're saying diversity, equity, and inclusion? And for our stakeholders who advocate, just like you guys do, what should they know so that they can advocate that?
Mm-hmm. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are definitely salient constructs, are really important ideas that should be at the center of each one of them. Diversity in particular, we should really be centering on the idea of representation. When we think about inclusion, we're really centering on the experiences, the lived experiences of individuals. And when we're thinking about equity in particular, we should really be centering on outcomes. And I share that to say, when we say diversity in the context of discussing race and ethnicity, we're talking about the racial composition of a space. To what extent do we have folks of color, and then breaking that down to say African American, Latino, just all different, Asian American, et cetera. But we're really looking at where are we displaying a diverse representation of staff members, whether it's teachers, whether it's principals, whether it's the C-suite or chief executive officers, chief financial officers, et cetera. But that is very important because we'll talk about composition and trends. Where are people most represented? And in a lot of our contexts, we're seeing folks of color are heavily segmented to dean of students roles, disciplinarian roles, student culture and student climate roles, but they're not necessarily within financial leadership of the organization, within instructional leadership of the organization, or within senior leadership as the CEOs of organizations. When we think of boards, it's the exact same thing. So what extent do we have racial representation on a board? And when we do have it, is it symbolic? Meaning these are folks on advisory committees, but they're not necessarily folks that have real voting power. When we think about inclusion, again, when I say experiences, we're thinking about to what extent are folks of color feeling affirmed? Are they feeling valued? Are they feeling seen, heard? Do they belong? How are they being treated? Treatment is at the center of experiences. And when we think about outcomes, we're really thinking about to what extent are outcomes for a school, are outcomes for a network, a district, or any organization able to be determined along racial lines. Right. So to the extent that I can look at academic data and I can predict where students will perform based on race alone, that displays the depth of racial inequities or disparities that lie.
Right. And
to you want to add anything on to that, Lucy?
Well, I just wanted to, and Lucy can definitely jump in here, but for the diversity piece, you're saying it's about the variation of representation in the numbers, the amount, whereas the inclusion is about the experiences of those who are being included. But you mentioned an example of diversity where there's, there can be symbolic representation in the person may not actually have any power. Inclusion would be the addition of that
yes.
power.
Yes.
Just to tie those two things together, and I'm sure you and Lucy are going to move forward with what that means for equity and governance, like you said.
That's right. That's right. And I think that those distinctions are so important to understand, because often folks will they will explain them to be the same, and they're not the same. It is very possible to have a racially diverse context in which, when we drill down, the folks of color within that institution or space have no real power. They have no access to decision making. They are not fairly treated. They have the highest turnover rates within the organization or the school. Their voices do not feel, heard. They're experiencing multiple levels of oppression in a space. And even when we think about outcomes, we can even predict their performance. Even when you think about schools, teacher evaluation, school leader evaluation, are we able, aside from just kids and academic outcomes, to what extent are we able to determine the performance of anyone within the organization along racial lines? That's also something, to explore. And so it's important to think about, where does a school or a school district lie in all three domains? Because it's easier for folks to feel comfortable and feel that we've arrived because we have a colorful school or a colorful network or organization. And that's also not getting underneath the ways in which folks of color, if they're not intentional, can also perpetuate both white dominance, white supremacy, and all other forms of oppression, even though I am Black or brown.
Right, absolutely. And thank you for that. And I didn't know if Lucy wanted to respond to that as well.
No, I think, oh, sorry. I'm gonna unmute. We're just trying to get together. So I was going to say, when we think about boards, especially boards across the nonprofit space, and certainly the same pans out in education, is that the boardroom tends to be the least diverse. And so only about 10% of education nonprofits have a board chair that is a person of color, while almost 70% of students who participate in schools and those services are students of color and students from a low-income background. And so underscoring the need for representation or increased diversity, but not just in terms of appearance, but also in value and philosophy and practice.
Right. Thank you. So we're hearing, what both of you are speaking to is, or something that the both of you highlighted is, we have to go beyond, essentially what you're saying is we have to go beyond, if the right amount of right-looking people are present in the room, right?
That's right.
Because that does not necessarily translate into the power and authority to make decisions and really change the structure and the operation of how schools work, right? And
Absolutely.
So given that, we need to look at that in a few ways, right? So one, to Crystal's point, we can't have all the Black people all the Black people who are involved in the school be the dean of culture or the gym teacher, right? Or the band teacher. And all of those roles are important and valuable, but they're not the only roles that Black people should be able to occupy. All of the bilingual, all of our Hispanic, staff members shouldn't be, the on-call translator for things when they are indeed the math teacher, right?
That's right.
Or that they can only be working at the front desk or, in those kinds of capacities. So we're thinking about folks being in the room, but not necessarily, folks being in the organization, not just in a way where they are pegged to stereotypical roles, right? But are actually present throughout the school in the organization to be able to have power and make decisions on all levels, leading up to our boards, right? Our governance structure. So talk to us now about, what are a lot of our boards looking like? And what should they look like to make sure that they're moving from diversity into a more inclusive governance structure where power is shared amongst diverse people?
So the important thing to know, as parents, is that at the end of the day, while our school principals hold the responsibility of shaping the vision for the schools in which we send our children, they, in our context, are reporting to an entire senior leadership team of a chief executive officer or an executive director. Essentially, these are their bosses. And above then that highest ranking individual in the organization sits the board. And so often when we're thinking about who has the responsibility of really selecting who the executive directors are going to be and who the chief executive officers are going to be, these are not things that are randomly, selected, or folks are happening into the board. The board, as a governing body, has a responsibility of recruiting and selecting the chief executive officer or the executive director of that charter management organization or of that school. And with that, that means that the board is essentially managing a singular employee, and that one employee of the entire board is the CEO.
So
and when we think of
who they're picking and what they're going into that decision with.
It's very huge, because at the end of the day, within our context, because we have a different system, in terms of how things are not necessarily centralized in the traditional format of a public school district. You're going to have the superintendent in a traditional context. You're going to have the superintendent, and they're going to oversee a central office team, and then they're going to oversee the principals across the entire city. In our context, our chief executive officers they operate by way of their roles and responsibilities as their own mini superintendents, essentially, of an entire network or portfolio of schools. And so when you think about the roles and responsibilities of one, they are selecting who the principals are going to be. They have termination power. They have the power to shape the overarching vision and goals of an organization, what the values are going to be of an organization, the financial management of the organization, where dollars are going, where they're not going, and just so much influence. And so that said, if the CEO has that much power, how much greater is the power of the governing body overseeing that individual? And so that's why we have to think about who is sitting on our boards when we think about composition, because number one, we want to make sure, and a great goalpost for this in our city is making sure that our boards at minimum mirror and have the racial representation that matches our city. Our city is roughly 60% African American. So when we think about that, it shouldn't be the case that we have a charter school board of which the over 80 to 90% of our children in this context are African American. But when we look at the board, we might see 80 to 90% of that board being white, being without folks of color. That is a huge discrepancy, because what it says is that we have not centered the voices, the unique experiences, and so much more that this particular community brings to the table in shaping education for its own children, right? And so when we think about that, we have to think about to what degree do we have racial representation on boards, but then also secondly, we have to think about in what seats are they holding on a board, because a board, very similar to the traditional ways in which we understand student government and student council, there's a president or there's a chair, there's a vice president, there is someone who oversees finance, there's a secretary. These folks have their officers, which means that they have even more responsibility and power on the board. And it may be the case that we have diversified our board, but it happens to be that all of our officers, that folks of color are not in officer positions on a board.
Right. It could
And
also
so that's, go ahead.
no, it makes me think about, you're aware of a lot of what's been in the education investigative news in the last 18 months. There's been a lot of drama, right? In one such case, there was a lot of conversation around what a board was doing, and that was one of the reasons why the school was under review. And when I went to look at, who was on that board, and in thinking, to your point, all the things that boards are responsible for, I was like, it wasn't very clear if the board members occupying their respective roles all collectively had all of the skills and the expertise to speak to all the things that they govern, right? So who's on the board that can speak to matters of curriculum, teaching, and instruction?
Legal.
Who's the lawyer on the board? Who's the certified accountant on the board? All of the things that you need to be able to speak to in a legal sense, in a sense of, in an authoritative sense, to make sure that you are in compliance, and then being able to know if you're doing things in an equitable way or an inequitable way. It wasn't very clear if the board was composed in a way to oversee all of that. And that's kind of scary.
It is. And to build on that, a trend that we may also see is that, okay, yes, we get the racial representation. Okay, yes, we have a couple of officer positions, but which officer positions are there? When we think about the closest proximity in terms of most frequent interactions normally with the board, is the board chair or the board president to the CEO, and seeing the trend, across a context or a space that the overwhelming majority of our board chairs fit two profiles, one being men and two being white.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in to talk about something that we just see as a lack, whether it's talking about the composition of the board or them being able to evidence a commitment to equity based on their procurement practices. And that's just, in many cases, boards are not strategic. And so if you have a strategic plan, if you have priorities, and we can set some of these milestones, it's a lot easier for boards to understand, what does our composition need to look like? So when we talk about that with boards, we sort of say, there are some sort of foundational things. To your point, you need someone in finance, someone in education, someone with a legal mind. But also, what's coming up on the horizon? Are we going through renewal? Are we in an expansion? What does the context say about what's happening? And so when we had this conversation just last night, over and over again in New Orleans and in other places, we could talk about Newark, California, there's always been a sentiment that stakeholders, community partners, parents and families have felt boxed out of their own students, their own children's education. And so thinking about the strategic engagement that has to happen, and we see engaging families and communities as a part of strategic decision making. And so if you're not leveling into the equation as well, what is the context saying? So not just what is good governance practice, but what does the context say we need right now? And I would venture that we need to have all of our board members, regardless of where they live, come from, or the bodies that they live in, their mindset has to be focused on equity. It has to be on creating the kinds of cultures and feelings in a space, regardless of what those spaces are, schools, boardrooms, community forums where everyone feels welcomed and embraced and that they can perform to their best. But I would say oftentimes there is not the strategic focus of many, many boards, and they are often really just one or two steps behind where they need to be going in the next month or two. So having strategy, having a real purpose and thoughtful and intentional practices around how we engage our stakeholders is often something that we don't see a lot of boards having.
Thank you, Lucy, for that, because that's actually a really nice segue into, what I want to get into next. And you said a couple of things. So one is centering other stakeholders, but particularly the ones that are going to be most impacted by the decisions that you make, right? And you can do that by making sure there's representation of them or their communities on the board. But then there's also that additional engagement piece. Everyone's not going to be on the board, right? But there's also this additional engagement piece around that. Then you mentioned, strategy, thinking about what it is that you need now and using all of that to drive decision making. So give us some examples. You talked about procurement. We talked about procurement and finance. We talked about families, working with families. We talked about teaching, hiring, and human resources and all that sorts of things. So what does, how do we know if things are equitable or becoming equitable, right, through those different areas? Mostly considering like the decision, by just considering the decisions that the board makes, how do we know that, these things are getting equitable? What does that look like?
Yeah, I would say, sorry. I would say the first step that I would offer is just to audit the practices that you have. And again, any board is always going to be time or resource constrained. So maybe we're going to look at our hiring practices and retention. Perhaps we're going to look at our vendors, and it's just looking at the folks that we are giving money to. I mean, schools are always, again, resource constraints, and we don't give money away, but we spend millions of dollars in who we contract work to. And so just figuring out what is that number and what % of that number are local to New Orleans or whatever your space is. Which ones are minority and women-owned LGBTQ-led organizations? Do they only fall into certain categories, or are we using them for professional services? Is it just kitchen and custodial? And so I would say just doing an audit and having that be a constant thing. There's an example of a couple of schools, one in Texas, one in DC, where we talked about good intentions can yield to bad outcomes. One of the things that they found was something Crystal mentioned earlier. Predominantly the people of color were in the sort of deans of culture and student supports, right? And there were fewer opportunities for advancement as well as professional development. And while they had an equity statement and the board was having these conversations, it didn't prevent the impact, right? But what it was, because they were constantly auditing and interrogating their practices, this came out and they were able to do something about it. Another in Washington, D.C., they were really focused on bringing in staff and faculty from the community and building pipelines. And so in the sort of teacher assistant role, what they realized for Washington, D.C., they weren't paying a livable wage for that line. And there was no one on the board who was from that community, right? Or in that sort of income bracket. And so once they interrogated and found out we weren't paying a livable wage, they were able to increase the line for everybody. And so I think there has to be this ongoing evaluation. And again, I would say a board can prioritize their practices. So maybe it's going to be people, and then maybe in the next 6 months, we're going to look at our financial practices. But I think it has to be always an eye on figuring out where we might be going wrong and then taking steps to correct.
Nice. Thank you. And Crystal, can you jump in here? I like what Lucy offered, that you should interrogate your practices. You should audit what it is that you do. Take a look at it in terms of what the numbers and what the qualitative, experience and qualitative data as well is telling you. Focus on an area and go in on that area, and then come back, reassess, and keep it moving. But can you also, augment that with some commentary on what should we be looking for in terms of equitable outcomes in these areas, right? So what does equity look like in procurement? You mentioned local contracts and making sure that DBAs are a part of that process, as well as historically marginalized groups in terms of gender, sexuality, and other things, language, other things. But what else? When we're talking about school staff, students, families, what are some of the things that are not equitable now that a board, through their decision-making process, can make more equitable?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start with the finance and procurement example, and then just move through each of the different buckets that you named. And so with finance and procurement, some very tangible things are, one, to Lucy's point, getting a baseline. We can't set any goals unless we know where we're currently, at. And that takes, it takes objectivity to be able to do it too. And so sometimes it's not that we're even pulling our own data, but we're actually leveraging third parties to do it, so that, we're telling the most accurate story as possible around where we currently sit. And so I think about using that to set very concrete goals to say that we want the vendors that we utilize of color to be at least 50% of our organizational spend. When we think about that, that can be in the area of professional development, that can even be down to copying services, to what venues we rent from, to what food, restaurants, like there's so many different things, on down to items such as toilet tissue, what companies we order from. Like those supplies and materials matter as well. So setting some very concrete goals around, to the extent that we say that we honor and we value equity, what does racial equity and really racial justice look like for us in terms of how we spend our money and how we espouse to spend our money? And a lot of that is also getting under the mindset and the beliefs piece, because for us to only designate that funding for catering, for entertainment services, is really perpetuating deep stereotypes about what Black and brown folks are best positioned to be able to do. And so often we will hear boards or any type of practitioner say, but we don't work with all these other folks because they don't exist. And that's far, far from the truth. They do exist. It takes research to figure out where we are, but it also takes equitable practices around where we market ourselves. Are we making our bids visible to everyone and anyone? Are we building relationships within our communities to even know that those services exist right here at home? And do we care to prioritize it? There are some entities that actually have thresholds as high as 80%. To say 80% of their vending and procurement actually comes from their city and or their state. And that's a very powerful message. So all that to say, the goals that we set numerically have everything to do with what we as organizations value.
Right.
To the extent that we value it, our dollars should match what we say we value.
Right.
When we think about representation in terms of staff, the same thing is true. In a context in which over 80 to 90% of our children are Black children in New Orleans, it should not be the case that our staff don't either mirror that or come close to at least majority of our staff being comprised of Native New Orleanians, Black and brown folks, and even thinking about composition across age and across experiences and how people are trained. What volume and degree are people are people traditionally trained? Are they coming from alternative certification programming? All of that matters because it's also sending a message around what we value. We can't say that we value a particular group and we don't see them represented. Because our children are also taking huge cues around their own value. If I don't see myself as a child on this team and on this staff, but when I do see myself, I see myself only in the role of being cafeteria worker or being in janitorial services, I'm getting a huge message that folks that look like me and come from my context are only good enough to do these roles. That in order to be successful and thrive, if I ever wanted to be an educator, I need to actually do it somewhere else,
Right. And I mean, it is counter to the message that they're asking children to learn in school, which is you can be anything, right? But the people that I see are not any and everything, right? In this building, at least.
Yeah.
They may, but in that building, they don't. So when a place that's supposed to be preparing me for my future social, professional, economic life, what you say you're preparing me for, I actually don't see represented in the professional life of this school.
Yeah.
And kids are not stupid. They pick up on these things, for sure.
One thing I would love to note as well, given the very unique structure of New Orleans, is that boards, especially if they talk to each other, build community, and come together, have an incredible opportunity to leverage that power to change the community. So if there are only a few bus vendors and they don't pay a livable wage, and those companies employ people in our communities, potentially families in our school, the conversation after my audit is going to be, I've come to realize that you don't, whatever organization is, pay a living wage. And so while we've used you for the last 5-10 years, we will only, starting 2022, be partnering with organizations that do X. And if every board has that conversation with any company, after a while, that's going to have to shift. So even though we're not giving money away and we're resource constrained, we have an opportunity to not be the thermometer, but to be the thermostat and say, this is what is acceptable. This is who we will do business with. And after 5, 6, 10 boards or charter management organizations and networks have that conversation, something will change and shift. So even though we're sort of small and a board may not see that power, having those conversations and committing to those values, not in just how we run our building, but who we will partner with outside of our building, I think stands to have a huge impact on what happens in the community.
Yeah. And it makes me think also on the talent and the culture in around, when we get beyond representation alone, right? And so we're not just deans and we're not just fulfilling culture roles, paying attention to the inclusion piece, right? Like we set very concrete metrics around how many folks that we're seeking to retain in a year, but we have to even dive deeper to say, do we have thresholds for the types of experiences that they are having, right? Are we paying attention to what our folks are saying in their exit interviews from the organization? Even around the fact that, 80% or more of folks of color within our organization can articulate that they feel psychologically safe, that they feel valued, that they feel heard, that they have opportunities to give input. All of those are concrete and tangible metrics that we can utilize to really keep a pulse on not just our folks here. Have we recruited them into roles, but how are they feeling? How are they doing? Are they getting equitable supports to even thrive and do their roles really well? Last but not least, I would say on the community engagement piece is really thinking about, boards really saying what concrete structures do we have to ensure that families and communities, their formal input and feedback is central to our decision-making processes, because we have to think about the input and the value add of families and communities on a spectrum and on a continuum. First of being, to what extent are we just informing folks? We're making the decisions and we're giving them the information on the back end. To what extent are we consulting with people as a second phase to say we are actively, before we're making decisions, getting your input? And that doesn't mean that you are necessarily guaranteeing that what they share will be automatically implemented. It does mean that we have concrete structures and ways for folks to always give voice to what is happening at any given moment in time. We move past consultation. We think about collaborating. We're working together. So in what ways do we give parents and community members the opportunity to make decisions with us? And that's a different type of process than me saying, I make it, I have the knowledge, I have the power, and then you're on the receiving end of what we have decided, which is education that happens to people. It doesn't happen with them.
Right. I thank you for all of that, because what you and Lucy just said made me think of a couple of things. So Crystal, starting with you, basically what you're talking about is something that keeps coming up during this Public Education Week series, where we talked about a variety of things, but community keeps coming up, right, as something that should be central in this public education system. And always, 'cause that's basically what you're saying, center the community in the school, from operations to leadership on down. And earlier, when you mentioned, you were talking about procurement and, who we choose to spend our money with. And what I wrote down, I was like, this is really a matter of, it's bigger or deeper than what where a school decides to spend their money. What we're also really looking at is a redistribution of public funds. And so there are a lot of schools, not a lot, there are some schools in the New Orleans public school system that is able to raise their own source of funding to support their work. But the majority of our schools, the majority of their funding comes through local, state, and federal tax dollars. And so when we have that, if you're getting when you were at the school, how many students did you have at that school, Crystal?
Probably close to 450.
450. So if you multiply that by the $10,000 to $12,000 that you would you're looking at a lot of money that you are responsible for, right? Now, a lot of that, and so you have to be mindful about where, every place you put a dollar is a vote.
Yes.
You're either voting for a diverse staff, or you're voting for white staff. You're voting for a veteran teacher staff, or you're voting for a novice teaching staff, right? You're voting for diverse vendors, or you're voting for, a vendor body that's not really diverse. And you're taking our public dollars and saying, I'm going to vote for all white everything, or I'm going to vote for, all, non-local everything. You're making those decisions with our tax dollars, and we would like to see our tax money reinvested in our communities, in the communities where the children come from, right? Because by supporting those communities, we support children who are then able to come to school and learn, because their communities are supported. They have the resources that they need from their community. It makes it that much easier for them to engage in school. So that's really important. And I like what Lucy said about, basically boards have the opportunity and the power to make structural changes across the system by ganging up for equity, so to speak, right? So, there's a large opportunity here to really change the way in which we work and how wealth is distributed and who is supported. And so that's why, from the vantage point that I see and kind of boiling down from the points that you guys made, this is another reason why equity on the board is really important. I just want to, kind of pivot a little bit to, you guys mentioned a lot of great things in terms of what boards should be looking out for and be committed to, and some of the things that they can do to get on that path. I'd like for you to provide just some takeaways, things that other education stakeholders, that would be students, parents, teachers, and other educator leadership, and other people outside of schools that have a vested interest in supporting the public education system. What are some of the things that they can do to address and enhance equitable school board governance?
Right. So one of the things I would want to note is to just trust yourself, right? I think qualitative data, energy, spirit is one of the things I always lead with. So when you walk into a building, what is your body doing? What is your gut telling you? What do you feel like? And oftentimes data is a way of boxing people out. And I think us trusting ourselves, parents, grandparents, aunties, community people, and then also looking at what the data says, right? So what does the report say? What is the data of my school? And when I break that down, what does it mean by subgroup? And so I think really sort of honoring yourself, understanding your experience, and then looking at the data to determine what has the experience been in other spaces. And then just looking at what people's practices are and how would I evaluate them? What are they doing? What have they written down? What have they made public? And then pushing that through. Does it seem as though they are centering my child, my community, my interest? And then I would say the other thing is to just ask questions. And so there are lots of resources available online. I don't always like that. And then the other piece around the resources that exist is what are schools doing, boards doing to help train and develop parents and community peoples to be able to access the information that is there. So saying it's on our website and creating a space to explain that and to develop people's knowledge and expertise around that is very different. And so what are the resources that are available for me to understand what's happening in my student space, I think is super critical.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Lucy.
And what I would add to that is one, making sure that we lean into knowing that it is our right to ask questions around what is our vision for equity, right? Like, it's hard to make decisions and move forward with any action if we don't have a clear vision of where are we headed to? What are we trying to make true for our students, for our school district, our network as a whole? And so I think making sure that no matter who the stakeholder is, that we're asking questions of our board around what is our vision for equity as a network, and racial equity in particular. What does it look like for us to have a racially equitable school as a concrete answer? I think the second part is to attend when you're able to board meetings when they are occurring. I think oftentimes for a lot of different reasons, we can have mixed feelings about being in that space. And I also think that that is a part of our responsibility as schools and also as board members to make folks feel comfortable to come to those spaces, to make sure that they understand that this is a space for you for us, and that it is open to the public. Because I think often there is this feel that this is private, or it's super formal and super executive. And so
It can be very intimidating.
Yeah, very intimidating, especially across different lines of socioeconomic status, and whether people feel as though they're really made to feel that they belong in the space.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that is one piece. And I think the third thing is really building an understanding of the different policies and the different practices at play within our schools and within our networks. Because oftentimes a lot of things are happening because a specific policy is written in that way that is allowing that phenomenon to be the case. And so one of our opportunities is to really influence the policy formulation process, to say, how do we give voice to what it is that we want? How do we get on the agenda to voice that? How do we get signatures and people to really be strategic about how we're even making problems, how we're increasing awareness of problems? Because oftentimes when masses don't understand that a thing is a problem, we're not rallying behind it because it's not broad, open, common knowledge. And so I think both using qualitative and quantitative means, and what I mean about qualitative is the stories, the narratives, the real lived experiences of folks, but also leaning on the data, and what the data actually shares is very important, because in our context, we have to really make sure that we're balancing the type of narrative that we're sharing, so that we're not on this extreme end of being able to say that everything in our system is great and it's phenomenal and this is the best thing that has ever been in existence for public education, but also going to the opposite spectrum of saying that everything in our existing system is horrible and is not good and is not strong. There's nothing good for kids that are happening. I think we have to stay away from the extremes and get to more of a balanced narrative of the truth of the wins that are happening, the successes that we may see, but the dramatic shortcomings that are in place at the exact same time, because I think it's much more of a gray story than what we're often telling. And often, depending on where we are, I think giving ourselves permission to ask questions is a good thing, you know, and really trying to address the ideas and attack the different ideas and make sure that we are really building a set of solutions that our parents want, that families want, that our children need. And it's hard to say that a solution is best for folks if they haven't been a part of the process of crafting it. If they don't feel that solution truly represents what they feel that they need. Because who's best positioned to know their own needs but people themselves?
Right. I think, you know, and we're going to, you know, sign off in a bit, but just to kind of wrap this all up, this part about being informed and knowing what questions to ask, but more importantly, how this impacts you. I think oftentimes folks may not be engaged with the board because it's just like, you know, that's them doing their thing. That's their job. And I trust that they are working in the best interest of my kids. I don't feel the need to be involved in every board meeting or those kinds of conversations about board composition. However, no matter whether you trust or don't trust, you still have to hold folks accountable, right? And you can't do that if you don't have information.
That's right.
You also won't be inclined to do that if you're not very clear on how something like board composition impacts.
That's right.
Experience in the classroom.
Yeah.
So it's being aware of those things. And you can love your school and you could, you know, love your board. I'm paying back here, I'm paying attention, I'm holding you accountable to the principles and values that the school is based on. If a partner is going to hold you accountable, right? And so if
yes,
you be partners with the school, if you want teachers to be partners with the school, they doing. So on that note, I do want to, I know you are busy. For those of you who will be listening to this, Crystal and Lucy, they persevered. We had some technical difficulties, and then they ended up in a cafe. So that's what you're hearing in the background. But thank you very much for persevering and coming through and having this really important conversation with us. I definitely like to continue this conversation, especially around how to get more community members on these boards, and supporting them and empowering them to have a direct and powerful say in what's happening in their children's educations. So thank you for kicking us off in that way. We are going to sign off. Thank you very much, Crystal. And we're going to, have some how people can get into contact with you, and how they can work with you.
Thank you so much for the work that you are doing, Nalia, in this city. You have no idea, you're a powerhouse. Thank you, everyone who is tuning into this conversation, because it's just that, as she said, it's a conversation that should not be ended. And asking questions is important and essential to what we do moving forward.
All right. Thank you. And extend my thanks to Lucy. You guys have a great day.